Welcome to War Room, the official podcast of the U.S. Army War College online journal, graciously supported by the Army War College Foundation. Please join the conversation at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. We hope you enjoy the program.
Make sure not to miss a single podcast and subscribe to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast, at iTunes, Google Play, or your favorite subscription service. The views expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect those of the U.S. Army War College, U.S. Army, or Department of Defense.
Hello and welcome to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast. I'm Jacqueline Whitt, Associate Professor of Strategy at the U.S. Army War College and the Editor-in-Chief of War Room. I'm so glad you've joined us for today's episode. Today we're going to explore an important but perhaps sobering topic, and it's one that matters to uniformed service members, veterans, citizens, and the families and loved ones of those who have served and those who have died in service to their country. And that question or that topic today is how do states, and in this case we're going to think about the United States, memorialize war, and especially how do they commemorate and honor those who have died in war. So if we think about military cemeteries, Arlington National Cemetery just outside of Washington, D.C., or the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific at Punchbowl Crater outside of Honolulu, Hawaii, or the Normandy American Cemetery in Colleville-sur-Mer in France. And these are iconic, reminders of the staggering human costs of war. And so here to help us think through and understand the significance of these sites of memorialization, history, and identity, I'm really happy to have in the virtual studio today Dr. Kate Clarke Lemay, who is acting senior historian at the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. Kate holds a PhD in art history and American studies from Indiana University and specializes in the intersections of art, memorialization, and military and diplomatic history. She is the author of the book Triumph of the Dead, American World War II Cemeteries, Monuments, and Diplomacy in France, which was published by the University of Alabama Press in 2018. And the book explores the relationship between art, architecture, war, memory, and Franco-American relations. It's also one of the most beautiful academic books I've ever seen. So I highly, highly encourage you to check it out. Her research honors include an IIE Fulbright Research Grant and 2 grants from the Terra Foundation in American Art. And right now at work, she's currently working on a new exhibit on the international history of the wars of 1898. And I'm really excited to see what that turns out to be. So Kate, welcome to War Room.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jackie.
All right, so let's start with a really broad question, which is often where we start, which is why are military cemeteries important sites for scholars of war, the military, and society to even think about or to understand?
That's a good question. And I like to start broad too. I like to think of the war cemeteries as a kind of window into the mid-century, but one with angled views. So depending on how you look, you can find histories of American art and architecture or histories of war and combat. But when you look further, you might also have some insight into French and European war trauma, especially in Normandy. And even further, you may find some tangled politics of art patronage and culture wars about artistic style that circle back to debates over how to best communicate memory of war. So the window is both, a bird's eye view, but also expansive. And there's a lot to absorb from these war cemeteries and studying them and understanding them.
So from a scholarly point of view, then, as an academic, how do you get started when you're thinking about war memorialization and the role cemeteries play? Like, what would be your entry point in?
Well, as an art historian, I always look at the object, and so the entry point in is to just let my eyes absorb and look and see. And because the war cemeteries were planned as a large project, so with disparate parts, with sculpture, as well as headstones, as well as monuments, as well as landscape architecture, so those are your individual components of the recipe, so to speak. But then there's this whole bigger idea that they feed into, which is to honor and remember American war dead. So depending on kind of what catches your eye first, that's how you can approach to these war cemeteries. And most non-academics, most people encounter these spaces through the headstones. The first thing that they see is what I think of as a landscape of death, just endless rows of war graves. And it's a very impressive view. It's one of the most moving experiences, a person can have, is to walk into these American war cemeteries and sites and just have that overwhelming vision before them of how many lives were lost during war. So
I think that certainly speaks, to my experience visiting different places, because they're so orderly and they're all lined up, and they're and they stretch for so far in so many directions. It does seem to me to be this sort of dominant feature in some ways.
Yeah.
But you mentioned other aspects, right, of sculpture, and there's often, like, there might be maps, and there's all sorts of other things. Can you talk a little bit about why those other elements are there?
They really are part of what in art history we think of as the Beaux-Arts. The Beaux-Arts is a French term for
that's a new word.
Arts.
I try to learn something every day, and it's happened.
It's spelled Beaux, and then the next word is Arts. So the Beaux-Arts is a 19th century school of thinking developed in Paris of how to build spaces, so big works of architecture, including sculpture and including landscape design. So the components were knit together as the pieces of the whole. And the cemeteries emerge from this line of training. If you study who the architects of these individual sites were, all of them were trained in this way, in the Beaux-Arts training. So they're not going to just, put out a cemetery and grid them together, and put, a marker on each grave. Instead, they're going to construct a whole system underground, into which a 6-foot headstone is then rigidly placed into. And that's why those rows are so rigid, because they have a system of architecture underneath the ground that holds them straight. They're also going to consider, the ways in which the rows meet up, not only in straight lines, but in circles almost, and sweeping diagonals. And also they're going to consider the main memorial and how that speaks back and forth to sculptures, funerary sculptures. So the architecture and sculpture hand in hand
work together.
How it all works together. Yep.
So you said they're all sort of trained in this school. Can you tell us a little more about who's making these plans for American cemeteries overseas?
They were the very close-knit group of men, mostly male architects, that emerged out of Penn, the University of Pennsylvania School of Architecture, and were taught by a leading architect named Paul Cray. And also, he was French, so he was trained in Paris, right? So there's a bit of a direct line of a very interrelated group. And they were part of the same kinds of clubs, like the National Sculpture Society in New York, the Century Club in New York. They were part of a group that, to borrow a phrase, sort of this good old boys club, if you will. And it was hard to get this job, actually. And so this is where if you dig into the history of the American war cemeteries, and see who they were hiring, then you can start to see how certain types of style was preferred over others. And so certain architects got the job over others. And all of this, of course, was organized by the American Battle Monuments Commission, the ABMC, which is in existence to this day. And that's the smallest agency of the executive branch of the federal government. So it's the United States government that's actually, providing the financial support, our taxpayers' dollars, our taxes.
Mm-hmm. And the American Battle Monuments Commission is then the people who constitute it are making choices about who to hire as the architects, who to hire as the planners, which then results in these, in the manifestation of specific ideas and specific ways of thinking in the real world.
But they weren't going to hire just anybody. That's the catch.
Mm-hmm.
They needed to feel really confident that someone wasn't going to be too daring, for the mid-century and go abstract, God forbid. So they wanted to make sure it was a figurative kind of sculptor.
Mm-hmm. So they themselves have ideas about what war cemeteries and war memorials should be.
Yeah.
And then go and find the people who can execute that sort of idea and that vision. When were the American war cemeteries, especially in Europe, we were talking about mid-century, are they all built at about the same time?
Oddly enough, yes, in a weird way. Because the war cemeteries overseas began after World War One. So the ABMC, becomes a group and is activated in 1924. And this is, some years after World War One ends. So it took some pivoting and some organizing to figure out, the best approach to creating war cemeteries for the United States in Europe. But they finally did. And so they started to activate the U.S. approach to war memory in 1924. But these sites actually didn't get constructed until 1936. So 1924 and 1936. And then, of course, World War II happens. And by this time around, the ABMC had figured a lot of things out. And so they were able to move more quickly after the war. But the war cemeteries designs didn't start until 1948. And then the construction didn't actually start until 1952. And it was completed by 1956. So you're looking at cemeteries that were conceived in the late 40s, or in the late 20s and early 30s. And when I talk about the mid-century, that's what I'm referring to. And so the two groups, the World War I cemeteries and the World War II cemeteries, are very similar, actually, if you break them down to design, because they were made basically in the same period.
At roughly the same time.
Right.
So here comes one of the random questions that just popped into my head. So we often think of burial and interment, right, as happening close to death. Right. Where people are buried soon after they die. Here we obviously have a big gap of years.
Yes.
Between the battle and the combat that takes place, soldiers dying, and the construction of these cemeteries and the burial sites and memorials. What happens in the interim between, say, a war and the dedication or the finalization of the cemetery?
I can only really speak to these two specific cases, so the World Wars, and what happens is that the American Graves Registration Service, or the quartermaster, came through and, of course, buried the dead, not only American dead, but also the enemy, that of the enemy. So many times you'll find in the archival sources, photographs, aerial photographs of the German war cemetery and the American war cemetery, and they're separated by, 200 feet. And so the fallen soldier is properly taken care of and buried and identified, and that is very, very well tracked. The AGRS and quartermaster, had this incredible system that they had been working on since the Civil War to do that. So that system had been well perfected by the World Wars. What was new and different was this design, this high design of, very articulate spaces. And that took time. And so while these sites were being planned, to make room for the appropriate landscape designs, so things had to be, land had to be graded according to a certain degree, for drainage, all these technical concerns that you don't even realize go into this. But you can imagine how bad it would be if things were to flood, say, in a cemetery. So it took years to do that. And in some cases, the temporary cemeteries were evacuated of the bodies, and then those coffins, which were sealed and airtight, to U.S. military standards, they remained above ground, covered by black tarp for years. And that was something that the U.S. government was very sensitive about and did not want to publish photographs of, these coffins that were stacked above the ground.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting to think about the different purposes of graves registration, of immediate burial, of the needs of families and all sorts of things, and then the impact that photographs of coffins lined up would have, and the difference between that and rows of headstones, right? Like that's yes. a pretty different image and a very different impact.
What was interesting for me in my research it was to also look at the French experience of the temporary cemeteries. And so I did a deeper dive in France in my research because I had to limit, these cemeteries in some way to make it a little bit more feasible as a project. Mm-hmm. So I just focused on the ones in France, which were still 14 of them from World War I and World War II. And what came across in a very striking way was how invested the Norman French especially were in caretaking of the graves of the American war cemeteries while they were still temporary cemeteries. So there's actually, there's only 6 if you count the permanent cemetery outside of Paris in Suresnes. There was only 6 permanent cemeteries that we know today from World War II that it's in France. But originally there were, 32 sites. And so you can imagine all these little French villages that have these temporary American war cemeteries. And this is still during the era when travel and tourism hadn't yet revived in France. It was like a war-torn country. So the French were, I believe, and I argue that they were channeling some of their own war trauma through the caretaking of these American graves. Because if you think about it, often the French families in an area had lost their own person, but they didn't have a grave to tend to. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people have disappeared.
Almost by proxy or
yes,
something.
Exactly. And I found that so moving when I kind of put that together. I thought that was a really important part of the war cemetery's history.
Mm-hmm. And I think you can still sort of feel that today. I had the privilege of being in Normandy at the 70th anniversary, and you can that connection between France and the United States it's palpable, right? As you sort of come across the anniversaries of D-Day and some other things, and the pride with which the cemeteries are sort of understood, and the place that they have there still seems pretty clear.
Yeah.
I wonder if you have some thoughts about what we learn about the United States when we look at the way the U.S. has, approached the question of memorializing its war dead, especially in the 2 world wars that happen overseas, where the casualties are for the Americans are quite high, not as high as other European combatants, of course. But these are fallen soldiers and sailors and Marines and airmen who don't come home, right?
Right.
What do we learn about the United States from looking at these places?
Well, I thought about this. I would say three things, come to mind immediately. One is that the U.S. is a very wealthy nation. No other country, was able to do this kind of in-depth design and move, fallen soldiers around to the extent that we did in order to create these permanent designs. And, the designs are made out of, the art and architecture is often made out of very high quality materials like marble. So, and, artists were hired, and this was the opportunity of a lifetime for them. They were paid very well. So that's one thing that we learned from these cemeteries, especially if you compare them to other nations from these world wars, the cemeteries of their nations. So, for example, Germany made its permanent war cemeteries in the 1960s after raising private funds because they were, they were not allowed to spend national money, federal money to pay for these war cemeteries because it might be construed as a form of nationalism. And that's it's all a very interesting long story, and we can return to that if you would like. The second thing that I wanted to bring up about what we learn about the United States is that in the mid-century, the U.S. American mid-century placed a value on collective group identity rather than that of the individual. And then the third thing, and we can go back to that too, and the third thing is that the U.S. mastered cultural diplomacy in a way that no other country could, and really deployed cultural diplomacy through cemeteries, through these war cemeteries, through the messaging. So, for example, after World War I, the demonstration of, hey, we were here too. Oh, and by the way, we're willing to sacrifice. I think that's the sort of secondary message behind that. And the same message underscores the World War II cemeteries that, hey, should you decide to turn communist, we're willing to die for what we believe in, by demonstration.
It's a permanent marker in some ways of the costs that people have paid.
Of the cost that they paid, but also what we're willing to pay. Like, it's a little bit of an implied statement of power.
Sure. You started the podcast by saying, as an art historian, you look first at the objects. Is there a specific object that you might tell us about in a little bit more detail that you think is particularly illustrative of either one of those 3 points or something else that you'd like to leave with our listeners?
Sure. I mean, I think everyone can picture the headstone, right? So the headstone is either in the shape of the Latin cross or of the Star of David. And on the headstone, the information that the U.S. American government chose to display is the name of the soldier, the state from which he, or if it's a woman, it's a nurse, she registered to be, enroll in military service, and the actual branch and rank that person served in. So if you think, okay, so there's a lot of information identifying this person. There's also the date of death. So if you understand the war and the conflict, say if this person died in, June 6th, 1944, you're like, oh, okay, that's D-Day. Get it. By contrast, the Commonwealth, so the British, affiliated cemeteries, they have the age upon death as well, and a personal kind of inscription of 60 letters that the families or the next of kin was allowed to personalize their headstone. And they also have different religions that are allowed to be, depicted or not depicted. If you just want to go with like the maple leaf, that was the family's choice. You didn't have to have a Latin cross engraved in this rounded headstone. But if you think in your mind's eye, if you can picture the American headstone versus these other countries' headstones, it's very clear that the U.S. was emphasizing a collective group. There's not enough information on that individual's headstone to really tell you much about the individual. But what you do know is, like this person fought in this battle. If you're a good enough military historian to know that and place that, and most people aren't. So the date of death doesn't really help a lot of people. Or, like the branch and like, like if he was a signals officer, you can think about like telephones and communications, maybe spying, I don't know. So there's a lot of information that's kind of murky, right? For today's 21st century, at least, that viewer. But by contrast, if you go to these Commonwealth cemeteries, you're very moved by reading the inscription on a 19-year-old's headstone that's like, "We love you, we miss
Right.
you, forever in our hearts, love, mom, dad, and sister." You're like, oh my God, this kid, he was like...
That's about a personal sort of connection to family and to country.
Right.
Whereas the information on the American headstone is all tied to the state.
It's all tied to the state.
Right.
And it's very, so for today, we're much more interested in, it kind of just reveals too, like what the focus was in the mid-century versus the focus today.
Mm-hmm.
And the ABMC has done a lot of work to try to invoke the individual behind that gravestone. So it shows that how the interests have shifted. But, I really find it too bad that we didn't have those inscriptions. And actually, for those of you who are familiar with the cemeteries and have been to the World War I cemeteries in like Suresnes or Wazan or Ain Marne, they occasionally you will come across a headstone with an inscription at the back of the headstone. And so for about like a period of 4 months, the ABMC was allowing families to engrave inscriptions for American fallen soldiers, but there were under conditions, right? So the families had to pay for it. So not all families could afford it. And the other weird thing is that the families were choosing inscriptions that assigned them a sense of class. So they would either, quote scripture from somebody, famous at the time that signaled a sort of a waspy highbrow background, right? Or the other weird thing that they did was designate that the soldier had died in combat, which is a big, designation for World War I. Like, hey, my kid didn't die from the flu. Like, he died in combat, killed in action. So that, of course, establishes a
marker of status.
Hierarchy of death.
For sure. You've talked in a couple of places about things like religion or gender, which are categories that permeate our lives, but they also tell us complicated things about the times and places that we live in. How do things like race or religion or gender or class and politics, come into play in these spaces?
Well, what's kind of two things. One is that race and gender, and especially race, for the time, that doesn't come into play. And that's thanks to John J. Pershing, who was the secretary of the ABMC, after World War I. And he was the real mastermind of the equality across the board that you see. Officers are not separated, and nor are the cemeteries segregated according to race. Women are less in the picture. I mean, they're also not segregated according to gender. So that's, but there weren't that many of them that, the families were the ones that chose to let their loved one remain in Europe. So many of those women were actually brought back. The other thing about religion is, and this gets super complicated, but one of the things that I noticed is that in 1924, the Jewish there was a group of Jewish Americans who organized and lobbied Congress to include in the headstone design the Star of David. And that demonstrates how well organized that group was at that time. And you don't see any other religion acknowledged except for Christianity and Jewish religions in the war cemeteries. So again, that kind of speaks to who had power in society at the time. But Native Americans or people of other faiths besides Christianity, they're all buried under a Latin cross. And I find that problematic today. In the mid-century, it wasn't. But that's one of the things that I think the ABMC is going to have to really address, especially if, it's a Japanese American, group from Hawaii that's buried in AP now. I would imagine that those families are uncomfortable with that grave marker, but I can't speak for them. But I would imagine that kind of thing comes up.
And it's a place where we see significant change over time, like the religious markers in national cemeteries are much more expansive now than they were at mid-century. But what's the obligation to go back and rectify or change decisions that were made in a specific time in a specific place?
Yeah.
So I think it's a really interesting question. And I am really sad to say that we're all out of time. Time always goes so quickly when I'm talking to interesting people about interesting things. So as today's podcast comes to a close, I would like to thank Dr. Kate Clarke Lemay once again for joining us today. And I'd like to thank all of our listeners out there as well. Please send us your comments on the podcast, on this one or others. And we'd also love to hear your suggestions or ideas for future topics as well. We're always interested in hearing from you. If you've not already done so, I hope you'll subscribe to War Room via our website, which will put updates and content directly in your inbox. And you can also subscribe to A Better Piece on the podcatcher of your choice. And if you would rate and review the podcast, that will certainly help other people find us as well. We'll look forward to having you all again with us soon. And until next time, from the War Room, I'm Jackie Whitt.
And that concludes our program. Thank you for listening. The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or positions of the U.S. Army or the Department of Defense. Let us know what you think. Provide us your feedback, comments, or suggestions through our webpage at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. And have a great day.